So my goal with this presentation is really to address this such a common thing that everybody has struggled with. I struggled with when I was a junior faculty member at UNC Chapel Hill, and I see so many people still struggling with it today. I interact with clients and people who aren't clients, and I lots of people like, hey, there's this lottery going on. Maybe I should just send more submissions and that will solve my problems. And often that doesn't solve the problems. And so the grant lottery for researchers, I mean, it's really a no fun kind of place to be, this grant lottery, which is the pressure from so many people at institutions to submit and submit again. And that pressure is it's sort of this all-pervasive thing, especially for junior faculty members who go into a department, and almost universally I hear from people who are starting out just that they get this constant pressure from more senior people: submit, submit, submit. Oh, you got rejected, submit some more. And as if the number of tickets that you buy in the lottery were going to lead to more big wins, like it's Powerball or something. And it's not Powerball in that it's quite different. And I want to talk about the statistics of that a little bit later. But and so a lot of people from this really get sort of demoralized, because the submit and submit again, I understand where that comes from. Back in the 1990s, during the Clinton era doubling of the NIH budget and big increases for other funders, things were pretty easy in that sense. Things were pretty easy for a while. And you could pretty much submit something that was reasonable science, and even if it didn't get funded on the first go round, you'd get it back, you'd get some comments, you'd fix the things, resubmit it, and as long as the study section didn't have some reason to dislike you specifically, they'd usually eventually take some pity on you and fund the thing, because you submitted enough times, you were trying hard, you were responding to their comments. And so again, from that kind of model, it makes sense to submit and submit and submit again until you get something funded. But things have changed just tiny little bit, and they've changed in the sense that most funders, it's like 1 in 10. Some at NIH, it's down to 1 in 12 proposals are funded with an 8 percentile or worse pay line. I even heard somebody say the other day that it's 7 percentile. I haven't verified that with one of the institutes at NIH. Plus, on top of that, we have some potential changes coming to funders near you, especially if you're in the US, that might make that even worse. So, so does that old thing work of just submitting until they take pity on you? Well, no, because the competition is too fierce. I mean, it works from the sense that sometimes you might sort of strike gold. You might actually have the winning lottery ticket because you had the right confluence of stuff in your proposal that we'll talk about in a little bit. You had the right confluence of stuff, and therefore you landed in that study section, and people happened to get really excited about your proposal. And wow, awesome. And then you get funding. And sometimes that happens. I mean, it's unpredictable. That is random when that happens, when you're just in this lottery mode. But the problem is, think about 1 in 10, if that's the average. I know everybody thinks, hey, but I'm not average, I'm above average. So it's average to think that you're above average. So just think about that for a second. And so, I mean, I was certainly average or even below average when I started this at UNC, just submitting and submitting and submitting again. And I was quite demoralized by the end of a string of 6 major submissions, plus some various random minor stuff, 6 major submissions that I worked really hard on within the first about year and a half that I was at UNC. And not only was I not getting traction with those, but scores were generally getting worse. Reviews were getting worse. That was true of an NSF proposal that I was working on that I resubmitted, and the scores got worse on that. It was true of a large program project grant that we worked together on that we got somewhat close the first time, and then we revised it, and the score got worse. And then I decided to submit an R21 because my R01 attempts weren't gaining traction. And that was triage, my first and only triage, which was really the wake-up call for me about that this submit and submit again was clearly not working because it was like a downward slide of, you could say, here is my happy I felt, my happiness, and my scores. They were all on this downhill slide. So it really is a nightmare for people that I find caught in this game, caught in this mentality of you just got to keep, submitting and submitting. Yes, you do need to keep submitting, but do you just need to keep submitting randomly as often as you can? I think the real answer that I have seen over the years is probably no to that. And so the way the probably no, I'll even put that in quotes, probably no, to the just submit. I'll put that up here. Just submit. The answer is probably no because of strategy. Because, working with people over the years on this and my own turnaround has really illustrated to me that there is a certain quality to grant proposals that really makes a difference. There's a certain characteristic of grant proposals that makes a difference. There's a quality, and I know that sounds very vague, but I will try to, throughout this presentation, be less and less vague about what I mean by that. There's a quality, there's a characteristic. And some people in the past have just called it art. It's just art. Some people are good at it and some people aren't. And I agree that there is an art form to this, but I don't think it's art in the sense that only a few super talented people can do this, and that's it. I think that it is a thing that can be systematized. And one of the things that really opened my eyes to this has been working with AI. Now, you may love it, you may hate it, you may be, middle of the road on it. I'm not like a fangirl of it in the sense that of thinking, wow, it's going to solve every problem or that it's going to write my grant proposal for me. But I do appreciate it for what it can do, and I think it can be really helpful in certain instances. But I was, of course, looking into it, working with clients on grant proposals and saying, how can this help? And to what extent can it help? What are its capabilities and its drawbacks? And what I saw is that AI can very confidently present something that it thinks is good that on the surface sounds like, this is well written writing, but you read it and there's a hollowness. So I'm just going to write this also, AI and hollowness, hollow. There's just the writing feels hollow. It sort of lacks a substance. And I've really worked to figure out, well, what is it that is the substance that this is missing? And how do we fill that in so that we can use this tool? Because this answers another question that I had from years of working with people. So my own approach, back when I learned from a mentor how to do it better after all of those rejections, I worked with a mentor. He tore down a specific aims page multiple times. I was in tears, but eventually I listened to him, revised it several times. Then finally he said, this is good to go. I submitted that and wrote the rest of the proposal based on what was on the aims page. I submitted that and it got funded on the first round of submission of a brand new proposal I had never tried before, after all of those rejections, something changed. And the thing I learned there was iteration on a specific aims page. And that's how he did it. And that's how I have worked with clients for years on it. But sometimes the problem with that is iteration. The problem with iteration has always been convergence. Now that might be like, well, what are you talking about? Right below that nice frothy mug of holiday cocoa or whatever. What do you mean by iteration and convergence? Well, okay, so I'll admit it. I'm a geek. I'm a former computer scientist. And in computer science, when you iterate, when an algorithm iterates, there are many iterative things that sort of, they don't get the answer right away, and they have to iterate over a space of possibility before they can converge to the best possibility, to the right possibility. And there was that thing going on in grant proposals, I noticed, that we would iterate and we would iterate. And with some clients that would converge, sometimes quickly, sometimes it would take a while, sometimes it would take a long while, sometimes we would never quite converge. And so when we hadn't converged yet, especially for certain clients, there would be like an issue that it was sort of like what AI does now, in the sense that they could often get to a point where it read well, it seemed like it was pretty good, but there was just some kind of substance missing to it. And I could tell that there was something missing. And so I would say, yeah, it still needs something. And I would do my very best to figure out what it was that it was missing and give them specific advice about that. But a lot of people would get frustrated with that because that takes a long time and you never know when you're going to get to that convergence point, and sort of be done with whatever it is that was going on underneath the surface. And so it's interesting that I was going to present this anyway, but the insight I had in the shower that I took a while back, is that there is this underlying thing that I was going to talk about, but that is really key to all of this problem. And so I'm going to talk about the thing, but I'm going to build to it a little bit. I'm going to leave a little bit of suspense of what that thing is, before I actually get into the thing and describe what it is and how to do it. Okay, so one more thing before I get into, well, actually, this is a symptom of that thing. So this is perfect. Okay, so on this sort of segment of the talk, I wanted to talk about great science and how it isn't enough. And I've always said this to clients, that there's this old myth that is out there in the grant writing world that if you just have great science and just put it onto the page, that should be enough. You shouldn't have to do any fancy grant smithing thing. And I've heard that over and over again. And I mean, yes, you need great science. If you're doing a research grant or a science-based proposal, you need great science. But is that enough to get funding? And the question is, what is great science? What is great science? And here's where one of the problems occurs, is that there isn't a single fixed notion of great science that just exists for all time, all places, and all audiences. Take the example of fashion. Okay, and I'm not really one to speak about fashion, so here I am in my like fleece Eddie Bauer top. So I'm not like a fashion person, but I understand a little bit about what goes on. And there are some fundamentals that are always true in fashion. Like you kind of need something to cover the lower half of the body, and for many people who identify as women, usually something to cover the upper half of the body is also appropriate. Okay, so those are some fundamentals we can all agree on. And just like there are fundamentals to fashion like that. There are a few fundamentals to science, like replicability and careful observation. And so there are a few fundamentals like that. Okay, great. Well, if everybody is doing those things, you're not going to stand out for doing those things. Then the question is, how do you stand out? And we can refer back to the world of fashion. And yes, though everybody might be working on tops and or bottoms or some combination of both, if it's like a dress or a jumpsuit, they work in the details of what those are. And there are trends that happen in the fashion world clearly towards which things are in vogue at any given time and which things aren't in vogue. And I know scientists, researchers really hate being thrown in with fashion. And I hated it, but it really is true. Like as having stepped outside of that system for a while, I can see it more clearly than ever how much there are trends, there are fashions, and those trends and fashions are not just general trends. Sometimes some of them are general trends, but they also can be very specific, focused within a given field of hot topics. So like I was working with a client on a call. It was probably about a month ago, and we were talking about how there was a particular program officer who wanted one type of science, but not this other type of science. And it just so happened that he was like, "Well, this is the hot thing, not this thing." And so if you apply for something that's like this, I'll be much more excited about it than if you apply for this not so hot thing. And that was a very clear case, but it happens all the time. It happens on study sections. We're human. We can't avoid it because this great science thing relies upon this idea of pure objectivity. And I've never, well, I shouldn't say never, but the more I study objectivity, the less of a fan I am of this idea of, quote, objectivity, because objectivity really always depends on perspective. And in a universe of like 10 to the 23rd stars, in this vast universe, and the universe of ideas is also very vast, similarly vast to the size of our physical universe, there are almost an infinity of perspectives that one could adopt on different things. And so, given that, the idea that objectivity is dependent upon a certain perspective of what facts you're looking at and how you're interpreting those facts and how you're presenting them, that really what we're saying as a generic sort of objectivity is really just a chosen perspective that a given group of people choose at a given point in time as being the right thing. And that feeds into this idea of great science, that it's just a perspective on what great science is, and it has evolved over time. So the second, so that's a really important thing, and it applies to your grant proposals, because if you think, well, of course my science is good, so it should just stand on its own. Well, have you really thought about how the particular science you're bringing into that particular proposal fits that particular audience and what is in vogue for them at the time? Or that you could feel like, based upon what is in vogue, even if the thing you're proposing isn't in vogue, that you could convince them that it's exciting enough that it could be in vogue soon, right? So that thing of perspective is really important, and understanding that great science isn't just a fixed constant, that it's a difficult moving target in a grant proposal. The second thing is, there's always this idea that the corollary to great science should be enough is that great science will speak for itself. And for time reasons, I'm just going to give a very short rant. So here in the United States, things politically have changed a lot. And regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, it's pretty hard to deny that it's probably going to affect science and scientific research in some ways, cause some potential upheavals, cause some changes, and that it's going to be probably the focus will be changed. And so what I'm trying to say is there's kind of a poop storm in some ways coming, potentially. And it just amplifies this thing that I would have said 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but now I'll say even more adamantly, great science does not speak for itself. We must speak for our science. And this was always true in grant proposals, but now it's also true for the very survival of the scientific enterprise. If we as researchers and scientists don't learn how to speak better for science, more powerfully, more clearly, for the value of science and research, we will lose it. We will lose it. The writing is on the wall, and we have to stop screwing around with this. I've been trying to convince people of this for years, of the importance of learning how to speak for your science, not just taking it for granted. And you can't put your head in the sand anymore, because if you just take it for granted, you might be out of a job, you might be out of funding, you might be out of everything and doing a different career. And maybe that's what you want. I mean, that's what I ended up doing, but then I'm still working with scientists, still trying to help as a third generation scientist, because I don't want to see this scientific enterprise go away. I think we contribute great value to the world. But we've got to stop with this idea that great science will speak for itself. No, we have to become its advocates. We have to become the people who speak and present a point of view on the science that says, here's why this science is valuable to you, dear reviewer, or dear public, or whomever we're speaking to. And we have to learn to really advocate for it. And in order to advocate for our science, we need to understand the value in that science, the true value. And it's so easy in times that are easy and plentiful to get sort of lazy. I was lazy. So I'll say that about myself, and just because I'm a great example of that. So I really took it for granted when I started my faculty job that like science funding was going to be there, and that of course what I'm doing is important. I'm working on the proteogenomic mapping of the human genome and blah blah blah. So I was like, of course. And if somebody asked me, of course, this is heady stuff. Of course it's important. Right. Well, that I found out didn't work with grant reviewers very early on, and it doesn't work with the public. It doesn't work with the people who actually support funding. And it's kind of, I'll say about myself, it was a lazy attitude that I didn't want to spend the effort to actually find out how to communicate about the power and importance of my science. So I really encourage you that if you take nothing else from this talk today, that you take this idea that great science is not going to speak for itself. You must be an advocate. You must learn to find the value in it relative to any given audience you are speaking to, and be able to communicate that value to them. And that everything I said applies very much to grant proposals and everything else. All right. So then, one of the other sort of getting off the soapbox, one of the other things that I have seen over the years, and that I had too, was this idea of quick fixes of, hey, well, I'll just fix what reviewers say and it'll be okay. And let me actually show you an example if I can here. Okay, so this is an example that I'm going to use for a different purpose, but it's also a great example for this quick fixes thing. This I submitted as an NSF standalone proposal. At the time, it was like a medium-sized proposal. And yeah, it had multiple problems. So it was not supported. I mean, there were one or two of the reviewers that were moderately excited, and I thought, yay. But when I went to my mentor with the feedback that I got on this, he's like, no, you weren't even close. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll fix it. So I actually moved around. I moved around the words a lot, and I don't have the other version to show you here. And then I resubmitted it. And I thought that it read better. but I didn't change the underlying idea really. I resubmitted it and it got worse. It got a worse result. So, and I see this all the time with people who are doing that same thing that I did of just like, oh, if I just rearrange the words somehow, or maybe just tweak that one aim that they didn't like, or add in this little experiment that they said was missing, that somehow that it's going to be enough. So the best example of this, again, I don't have it here and I'm already worried about time. So I'll just say it out loud, is the best example is a proposal of mine that got a 52 percentile. And I reworked it completely. And on the next time I submitted it, it got an 8 percentile score. But I really rewrote that thing from the ground up, really rethought the thing. It wasn't just moving words around, it was really thinking about it more deeply and presenting an entirely new specific aims page, not just a few little tweaks. And I have come to believe from working with hundreds of clients over the years that it is more than just little tweaks that are almost always necessary. I mean, if you get something, if you submit a proposal, let's say to the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and it gets a score that's very close within a few percentile, that's a case where, okay, now we're talking potentially some tweaks because you probably got the study section already excited enough that they were excited to go in and advocate, just not quite enough to push you over the line for funding. Maybe there are tweaks there, but if you're in the 20 to 30 percentile range or triaged, please do not ever think that it's just quick fixes. It's not. It always requires much more work than that, and it relates to the big reveal that I'm going to talk about. But I always scratch my head with this. I guess that also connects to the big reveal. I scratch my head like, well, what is it that we're actually fixing here? And what is enough to fix it to get a better response next time? What is enough? And I'll just put that down as a question. What is enough? What is the quality or characteristic of the fix? Okay, let's talk about, the next one. More facts and data is not equal to a better proposal. And so I think this is a great illustration, this one that I already showed you. We propose to use ultrastructure theory to create a system that helps both our lab and other researchers manage a variety of data, blah, 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 blah. And then why I say this is a negative example, by the way. I'll just put negative here. Negative example. So you don't think that I'm promoting to do it like this because it did not work. Okay, so this is a negative example, especially if you look at these aims. I just outlined we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this fancy thing, and then we're going to do this fancy thing, and we're going to do this fancy thing, and then it's going to have this impact and this impact and this impact. Okay, so lots of facts, no story, and it didn't work. Okay, so I would love to tell you, and I have told many audiences in the past, that often if you tell a better story, that that you get better results. Well, I rewrote this one with a better story. I don't have the example here for you. It is better. It's not perfect, but still it didn't get traction. So this gives a hint to something, that a story is a good story, is necessary, but not sufficient. A good story is necessary, but not sufficient. So I am still very much a believer that we should tell stories. I recently saw this interesting paper. I can send out a link later to anybody who's interested. I don't remember the journal name, but they studied successful proposals, and it was a statistical study, so it didn't give a lot of insight, but one insight that it did give is that proposals with stories did better than those without. Hey, surprise, surprise. Okay, or at least there was a correlation, and a positive correlation with story, with narrative, as they put it. Interestingly enough, in that paper, they said, well, we kind of doubt that that actually should be the case. Shouldn't a proposal be just about the facts? And I wanted to pull my hair out when I saw that, or throw the paper through the window um, of the third floor. It's just, so here's why that frustrates me, that kind of statement, because it is story that gives context and perspective as to why this particular research that you're proposing to do is valuable. Again, story gives perspective and context for why this particular research that you're proposing to do is valuable. And that is entirely what was missing on this page. And I brought a little bit more into the revised version again, which didn't work. So it was also missing something else apart from story. But back to this story thing, it is so necessary to bring that perspective and context. And I do not know of a better way to do that for human readers, or even an AI reader, if we were ever to have AI review grants, which I think would be a really bad idea, because AI is a very poor judge of what's a great proposal and what's not. I've tried, believe me, but it's extremely poor at judging things. And so anyway, we just need story, and we don't just need a bunch of facts and data. And when I finally learned that was in this proposal here. This was that first R01. After I got all of those 6 rejections in a row, I worked with my mentor, and he helped me completely approach this in a different way, very much from a very simple and clear sort of story format for the proposal. And I'll zoom in a little bit more so you can read that again. And so this is what I did. This is what I submitted. I was like, wow, this seems too simple. It seems almost too clear. I had remembered when I was a graduate student and had written this paper and tried to write it very clearly, because it was a very complex technical paper about deconvolution of something, some kind of signal deconvolution thing. And so I tried to make it simple and clear. One of the reviewers actually said, this is too simple of a paper, and dinged me for it. Fortunately, the editor said, I'm going to ignore that reviewer, because anyway. So I saw this and I'm like, am I going to get dinged for being too simple? And no, I did not get dinged for this. I got a 6.7 percentile score for an R01. And the pay line at the time was probably closer to around 20 percentile, and 6 percentile is less than 20 percentile. Yay. So I got funded on the first round of submission. Very simple, very clear, very easy to follow what's going on here. Now, I don't have time to show the rest of this proposal. And of course, it went into more detail in the rest of the proposal, but I still kept it in this same vibe of this story, where I wasn't just spewing, facts, acronyms, data at the reader. I was keeping it very simple, very educational, very easy to read. So certainly this worked much better than my previous more fact-laden, very almost arrogant attempts that I had done, where I'm like, I'm this bioinformatician who knows all of this stuff that you poor biologists don't know, and therefore you should fund me. And that was honestly, I'm kind of ashamed to say, my attitude at the time, until I got beaten down again and again into not having that attitude any longer. All right, so let's talk about fewer submissions win more grants. And just for time reasons, I'll be very brief on this one. I discovered that after having a lot of rejections, that I could submit and I could write an R01, and it would often take me 6 to 8 months or more of iterating on it. And when I got to a point where I felt like, oh, this is good, like I feel good about this, then I would write the rest of the proposal and submit it. I even held off one of my R01s. I really needed the funding because I had a big team by that point. It was a renewal, not a resubmission. I didn't have to do any R01 resubmissions after that, but it was a renewal. And I I thought I needed to submit it by a deadline, but I looked at it, I'm like, this is not ready. So I'm like, I'm not going to submit this. So I waited for a whole deadline and I was really afraid, like, if they don't like this, I'm really going to be screwed. Like, I'm going to have to let people go, but I'm just not going to submit something that I'm not happy with, that I don't feel like has the quality yet. So I held off, I submitted that, and fingers crossed, hoping, praying, whatever, you know, jumping, rain, rain dances, all of that kind of stuff. And it came back with a 3.2 percentile score because I'd really put the quality into it. And I've seen this with clients too, really taking the time for quality and how that actually wins more grants. And I've done a separate presentation on that called The Hardest Decision. And I just don't have time to go, like, I actually did the math. And if you sit down and do the math, like look at the probability of funding if you write an average quality proposal versus a high quality proposal, what the probability is, and consider how long it takes. It actually takes you far longer if you're just submitting more lower quality proposals than if you are submitting fewer higher quality proposals. The math actually says that. So I'm happy to share that in the future. Maybe I should just do another meeting on it. Okay, so now we're to the turn. Now we're to the crux of the story, the big idea. So it's never about the writing. It's about the big idea that underlies the writing. So in the big idea, we can break down a big idea. So big idea, well, let me just explain what I think a big idea is so that I'm not too rushed, because if I rush so fast, you won't get it. So because I wouldn't get it. The big idea is the idea, the transformative idea at the heart of your proposal that's going to really make an impact on your field and do it in an interesting and new way. So it's that transformative, I'll just write transformative idea. Okay, that's really going to make an impact on the field. Now, this presupposes a few things that, like, in order to make an impact on the field, you have to understand what the field actually is doing, what they care about, where they're at, and how your work might actually help that field move forward. So when we work with clients on this, we break it down into two things. We break it down into a big promise and the big promise is all about what is the promise of the work. This is really the impact part of the equation. Okay, and it's really clearly defining this. Like when we work with clients, again, we try to get this down to 1 or 2 sentences. So I was thinking about an example I was looking at this morning, and it was for a U24 proposal that I've done a separate webinar about that one. And that one got funded against very long odds. And basically, the big promise, the impact of that was to make biomarkers more reliable for cancer research. That was the promise, to make biomarkers more reliable for cancer research. Now, you may hear that part and say, okay, that sounds cool, but how are you going to do that? And that leads us to the other part, which is the unique mechanism. And the unique mechanism is, how are you going to do that in a way that maybe other people have tried to do the same thing? How are you going to do it such that you have more potential, more possibility of actually accomplishing this where others have not yet succeeded? So that is what the unique mechanism is about. It relates to the innovation, but it's not the same as innovation. Innovation. It's a little bit more broad than innovation. Whoops. But I think when, for example, the NIH years ago decided they want a section in many proposals where you write, here's my innovation, this is really what they're getting at, because I think what they want is for you to really be clear about how are you going to accomplish this, where others, again, have not accomplished this before, because we can all make a big promise, but if we have nothing to back it up, then there a lot of skepticism ensues. And so these two things work as a pair. And I don't want to take complete credit. I wish I was that smart to come up with the big promise and unique mechanism, but I actually learned this from studying marketing in business, of all things, and understand, and people would talk about big ideas and the big promise and unique mechanisms. And I was like, wait a second, that applies to grant proposals. And that is the thing that we've been missing all along, was that big idea. A big idea that really resonates with that audience at that time in history, resonates with audience. I can't talk and write very well, so I'll just write audience. Okay, a big idea that resonates with the audience. And that's key. It's not just as if there are big ideas that are right and there are big ideas that are wrong. No, there are big ideas that are resonant with that audience at that particular point in history. And there are big ideas that are not resonant with that audience at that particular point in history. So if we have a big idea, there are actually two audiences we have to care about. And one audience is you and your team. So I'll just draw a couple stick figures here to represent you and your team. And then there's the funder audience, the funder community of program officers and reviewers and NIH council members, if you're going to NIH, and all of those kind of people. And really, the big idea has to not only resonate with the funders. I mean, that's the obvious one, that if they don't like it, then it's not going to go well. But it really has to resonate with you too. Like, I've seen so many people say, well, I'll just do this thing. In fact, I tried this. That was part of my series of rejections. And I even tried it a few times after I learned how to do better grant writing, where it's like, oh, there's an RFA for this thing. I think we could do something with that. And so let's submit something, because, funding's getting more scarce. So we would just try to submit something. I could not get that to work. I mean, occasionally as an auxiliary person, I got something, a little bit of funding here and there doing that kind of thing, but never with me being PI proposing to do something that I disliked. Now, I know somebody who was successful at least once doing that, of managing to get something that resonated enough with the funder that he got funding for this thing, but then he was like, oh, it really sucked, because then I actually had to do the work. Because if I didn't do the work, then they probably would never give me funding again. So it's very important that this big idea resonates with you and your funder and has a clear big promise and a unique mechanism. So I know I'm going a little bit nonlinear on you, because that's the problem with my brain, is that I'm kind of nonlinear. That's why sometimes I use all these slides, but then it just feels too like, yeah. So I already explained or gave you an example of big promise. And the example was biomarkers, to make biomarkers in cancer more reliable. So the unique mechanism that was paired with that was to do this thing called proteogenomic mapping, which correlates protein outputs with changes on the genome itself, mutations or aberrations that occur on the genome, and mechanistically tying those two together so that when we see a biomarker, for people who know what biomarkers are, when we see a biomarker peak, we're not just guessing statistically that, oh, maybe that's a significant peak, but we're actually understanding the underlying mechanism that generated the peak, and therefore are able to know much more about whether that's a good biomarker or not. So that was the fundamental idea. And why that worked, it was very resonant with the funder, because their RFA was kind of all about that, although in my opinion, it was not the best. It was kind of a poorly written request for applications. And so it was kind of confusing what they actually wanted, but this was our best guess as to what they wanted. And so that's what we proposed fundamentally to do. Now, notice I was able to give a pitch for this very briefly, like in just a few sentences, for what we were actually proposing to do. And your big idea you should be able to do that for your big idea. And it turns out when we were doing all of that iteration with clients or with myself, when we were doing all of that iteration, we were actually doing two things, two separate things, but we were conflating them together. Number one, we were trying to get that big idea really well defined and feeling like it was awesome. And number two, we were trying to write a clear and compelling story about that big idea. So two different things that we were trying to do all through iteration, and it's unpredictable. It doesn't work that well. And so story, I'll just finish by saying story is still a very important thing in this, but it comes after you have that big idea. And it's interesting working with people now on trying to identify the big idea and seeing the challenge that almost nearly universally all of us have as scientists to boil our ideas down to something as simple as what I just said for that particular project. Well, but I need more facts. I need more details. And I get it. I'm the one to pile on facts. Again, that's why I don't have slides, because I could just totally overdo it. I could have a slide deck of like 500 slides and keep going, right? But what would you get out of that? You wouldn't get very much out of that, because you'd just be like so overwhelmed and so exhausted. And this is true of our readers as well. We have to be able to boil things down and be more concise. And I'm perhaps the worst ever at that, but I'm trying, right? So, and I was able to do that for this. And that's ultimately what we have to be able to do for our proposals. And that is really at the heart of both what I would say is good science or great science in the context of a proposal, and at the heart of great communication, because those go hand in hand. So let me explain the great science part. That the big idea should be something that you have designed specifically so that it will make a positive impact on that particular scientific community. And you are using your talents and your gifts to implement this unique mechanism such that you are more likely to have that particular impact than you would be if you weren't using those particular approaches and talents and skills and equipment and techniques that you have. Okay. So it has to fit what they care about at this point in time. And again, it has to fit what you care about. So that's what really makes a great big idea. And I have, looking back on this, looking at what AI does with proposals, is if you just have AI write something based upon some nebulous ideas or thoughts that you have and try to write it into a proposal, the problem is it's going to be missing the clear and compelling big idea that resonates with that audience at that particular time, or that is likely to, best guess, likely to resonate with that audience. And if it's not there, people will read it and just say, well, it's well written. Maybe it was written by AI, but it's missing something. And that was what was always missing in those ongoing iterations. That plus the telling the story about it isn't easy either. So let me just say a few words about this. I don't have time for the examples, unfortunately, because I promised I was going to be more concise. So I'll just say about the story. I have this thing called the grant story funnel, and I show it as a series of layers that go like that, and then some layers that go off of that. And I have separate talks, and I'll do other webinars and meetings in the future about it. But really, the idea behind the grant story funnel is just that you've got to have this layered series of frames that lead to the core of your big idea, that tell the story of that big idea and make it clear to any reader, no matter where they're coming from, how overwhelmed or stressed they are when they're reading it, that they get and understand the core big idea of this proposal. And so that's what the story part is. So there's really this pair at the heart of every great proposal, like looking back at my own proposals and all of the client proposals I've worked on, every success story had that combination. Every single one. I cannot think of a single exception. They had a really clear and great big idea. that was resonant, and they had a very good story told around that big idea. So you might be saying, okay, that's all great. How do I get there? And I'm just looking at the time and I can't believe so much time has gone by. I'm really sorry about that. I was trying so hard to be brief. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on this, and I'll try not to be too long. What I realized, what I discovered working with clients is that we needed a process that we could generate the big idea with. We needed a process, not just random, because this big idea thing, it's a creative deal. Like this is all about your creativity. And you may, as a scientist, think, what creativity? And actually, I promise you, you are creative. And I don't know you individually, or I know some of you, I recognize some names here, but I promise you, regardless of whether I know you or not, that you are creative. The only thing is that creativity is often locked up inside of us, and we have to find ways to unlock it, unleash, and open to the creativity. And that requires a process. And that's especially what these first two steps of this process are all about, is unlocking that creativity. Yes, you read that right. Play is one of the steps. Having fun. Like many famous scientists who've made tremendous discoveries did it through a sense of just curious play that they brought to that discovery. And that led to incredible insights over time, is that sense of play. So our process that I'm encouraging you to consider as a process to adopt is to first lay the groundwork, understand your audience better. What do they want? And what is it that you actually want? And what are your, I like to call them magic powers, to just imply a little bit of playfulness. What are your magic powers, yours and your team's? And what is the potential convergence of those things that sort of narrows the scope so that you can then start the play process in earnest by priming your mind for, well, this is the overall thing I'm thinking I'm going to do, but just kind of a vague overall notion, not a very specific notion yet. Because the risk for all of us who've been trained academically is to rush to conclusions, to immediately rush to, well, oh, okay, I already got it, I'm going to start writing. No, that's performance phase, and that actually shuts down your creativity. The only job writing has in the play phase is if you are somebody who gets new ideas from free writing. So free writing means writing for yourself, just without any kind of style or structure, just writing for yourself to get ideas on the page. Free writing is great in the play phase, but I'll tell you, as soon as you get to thinking in your mind, there's going to be a reviewer or somebody reading this, then you have moved out of play and you have moved into performance, and you have skipped two key essential steps. And you will really do yourself harm. And that's why harm in the sense of, your progress on your grant proposal. So you will go backwards, because this is where you get into iteration. Because you're trying to combine the ideation step and the planning step, which is also a different form of ideation step, with the actual performance that you're going to give to somebody and they're going to judge you for. And most of us, when we think we're going to be judged for something, we do that thing very differently than when we think, oh, I'm just playing around with ideas and seeing how they fit together. So we do all of the play and the planning and the preparation with a mind map program. And if I had more time, I would show you that, but I'll save that for another day. I can show you more detail another time. We do that all in a mind map before we ever do writing. And one thing is that sometimes clients will come to us because they're so accustomed to the academic way of doing things, of just sitting down and writing. They'll come to us and say, here's some writing. And, we're in the play phase. And I'll look at it and say, no, we're not there yet. And I try not to be biased ahead of time, but never has somebody come to me with writing in the play phase where I'm just like, okay, you nailed it. You got it. Never has that happened. I wish it was faster, but it's not fast. We can't completely rush it, but we can systematize it, and we can have an approach. I just want to say one more thing about the performance writing, and then I'll say something about the planning, and then we'll move on. The performance writing, most of us have written a PhD thesis, I believe, or some kind of thesis thing, and have learned this idea of just sit down and write. And that's what I did. That's how I got my thesis written. A couple months of just sitting down and forcing myself to write and then revise and edit and so on. And that's fine. That works in contexts like that. And it can even work for papers unless they're really highly competitive. Then it doesn't work quite as well. It can work. I'm not saying it's ideal, but it can work. For grant proposals, I think it is the worst invention since now I can't think of an invention. Okay, so it's horrible. It really doesn't work in this context, because what you have to do is, like, if you're writing a specific aims page or the first page for a proposal, or even the rest of the proposal is in a very limited space, you have to make a very convincing, compelling argument for why this is more important to be considered than the next proposal that they're going to consider and look at. And that requires an incredible amount of precision, conciseness, including only the right facts, leaving everything else out, presenting it in the right order to really connect with the reviewer's frame of mind, with your frame that you think about this science, bring them together. And there's all sorts of incredibly complex stuff going on here if you want to have a high chance, a systematic chance at success at this. It's complex. Doing that all together in the writing is messy, and that's why it takes seemingly endless iteration. And so, even though I taught that for years because it's the best tool we had at the time, there is a better way. And I've seen this enough times working with clients that this is way better than the iteration approach, way better. And in fact, once we have the output of this in our mind map, a nice outline of the story planned out, I can put that in AI, and with some fancy work, we can actually get it to write like a specific aims page that is halfway reasonable. Because that is based upon both the big idea that we developed, which was purely human intelligence. I mean, you can brainstorm with AI and it might help a little bit, but it's pretty much human intelligence developing that big idea. And it's human intelligence that's also figuring out the layers of the story that you're going to present your big idea, what those layers are, what order they happen in. That's human intelligence, and that's one of the hardest things, perhaps even more difficult than the big idea part of this. So it's really these two things that I'll just add a red line here, that are the things that we're really doing that are human, purely human intelligence, that AI is not going to substitute for anytime soon. And then, interestingly enough, the actual performance thing, the thing that we've called grantsmanship in the past, that can now actually reasonably be done by AI if we do our jobs in these other steps. If we do our jobs in these other steps, that's the huge caveat. And my big fear is that people out there will just think, oh, Morgan said that you can do this with AI, and so I'll just do a couple iterations of something and get something reasonable and submit it. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. I have a friend who's on a study section and who says she can just tell, like, right away, like, oh, that's an AI proposal. And immediately there's a loss of credibility because the substance isn't there. So please don't just take this and think I'm saying that AI is easy. You have to still do your human part, and these parts are not easy. They are difficult, but it's still more easy having a process like this than if you just try to get into performance and do iteration. So, so the importance of developing these skills. I think this may actually be the last slide that I have. Okay, so I am going to wrap up because I'm beyond time yet again, and just say the skills of finding a big idea, of enhancing or unlocking your creativity so that you can come up with great big ideas. That's so valuable. That's really at the heart of what drives the best science is creativity, insight, curiosity. Some people don't like the term creative because they think it's referring to like artists painting and like I consider and I don't think that's what I'm defining creativity as. I consider myself creative, but I'm horrible as a painter. I'm horrible. Okay, so it's this skill of being able to think of things from new perspectives in new ways, put ideas together, consider it from different angles, consider it from their perspective, from your perspective, and come up with a way of like packaging things together such that people are going to be excited. So I'm saying working on the skill of unlocking that creativity and having a system to support you in doing that helps a lot. And the second thing is working on the skill of storytelling, of communicating once you have a big idea, of really understanding the framing that you have to present to powerfully communicate your big idea in a way that's most likely to connect with your reviewers and your readers. Those skills are fundamental. And they're fundamental not only to the grant writing thing, but they're fundamental to what I said at the beginning about science in general and that great science is not good enough. Because doing this is what could save science, not only your grant proposal, but could save science, is this idea of being able to come up with clearer and more compelling ideas for moving the science forward in your field, and then being better at telling stories about that science. That is how you can go out and advocate for science. That's the most powerful way is by doing great science and communicating about it. Those same skills apply equally well to the broader context of science and research. And so we do have a couple resources in case you want to get help from us on this stuff. So resource number one is what's called our Grant Foundry Accelerator. And I guess I'll write it in red because that's the pen color that I have. Grant Foundry Accelerator. So this is basically very simple in that we just walk you through a process one-on-one. We work with you one-on-one through a process over a span of about 4 months, basically through preparation phase, through play phase, through planning phase, and through performance phase. And at the end of all of this, we actually write the first draft of your aims for you with AI assistance so that you can see what it looks like. So you have a template. Now, our big goal here, we have two goals, but the big goal of those two is to really teach you this whole process for how to approach this so you can apply it to your future proposals over and over again. So that's our number one goal, is to teach you really this process and how to think about it and how to do it. Second goal of ours is to help you work on a live proposal and work on something that you're really going to feel solid about and submit, and hopefully that has a higher chance. I mean, of course, we can't promise anything because, again, it's context dependent. We never know what your reviewers are going to do, but we do know that higher quality, on average, tends to yield higher results. And I've actually seen it in the statistics, just looking at people who, the number of people who get funded from our past efforts where we're doing even this iteration thing that took much longer and was much slower. So, so that's GFA, and it's not inexpensive. It's, in the, 5 to 10K range. A lot of people will get support from their departments. We can break it into payment plans. And if you want information about that, you can just speak up in the chat. You can send a private message to Andrea Hackmeyer. She's here assisting and supporting. You can send a private message, or you can just speak up in the public chat if you want to too. But I know some people want to keep it private, so just feel free to message Andrea. If you're interested, we can send you a link where you can read more information about that. And if you're really looking for that long-term way of creating a system that's long-term sustainable for you, that's going to be the Grant Foundry Accelerator, is going through that. If that's in your budget, and I understand that could be hard for some people. So we do the best that we can to keep it at that level that you can make that work. And some people, by the way, do pay for that out of their own pocket because they realize that how important it is for their career to make this happen. And there are also sometimes other people in universities and institutions that will pay for this work if you ask. And I think the number one hesitance I've seen amongst people is just going and asking. The people who go ask often come up with the money to do things like this if they don't already have it, because they just ask different people and eventually somebody's like, oh yeah, I think that's a good idea, because of course it's a good idea. It benefits the whole university to bring in more grant funding and to have you be better at this. It really benefits, especially in this environment. So I think the case can easily be made for somebody to support you to do that work, and we can coach you through that. So anyway, just let Andrea know if you're interested in either Grant Foundry Accelerator in working with us, and we have a couple spots to get started this year before the holidays. Maybe one spot is all, and then maybe one or two spots in January. So it's getting pretty full. January is going to be very busy for us. So you might want to let us know soon if you're interested. And then just to wrap up, I didn't really have anything else in terms of slides. Again, I just want to emphasize, well, first, thank you for being here, because you're one of the smaller crowd that is really paying attention to like how important these skills are and developing them further. And especially if you made it all the way to the end, thank you for listening so long, even though I promised I would be shorter and somehow was not. Thank you for being here. And I just want to congratulate you for, if you take just a few of the things that I've shared with you today, how much that could benefit you, how much that could transform things for you. And please keep developing these skills. It's going to be critical to survival in the upcoming years, survival as a researcher, to develop and hone and further develop and further hone these kinds of skills. That's what will lead to survival, not just doing some nebulous idea of, quote, good science. Okay, so with that, I'll take any questions that we might have, if I can get my questions panel up on my screen, my chat. Okay, awesome. Okay, yeah, so I don't know if Andrea answered Melissa. Will the PowerPoint presentation be shared? Will the webinar be recorded? So we do have a recording. Okay, you addressed that? Yeah, but I didn't really use a PowerPoint this time. Okay. If only artists and humanists enjoyed the levels of funding available to scientists. I agree. I mean, I think that would be awesome if there was more and better funding for that as well. My mom is an artist and she made it work commercially, but she was always sort of on the edge of poverty for her life as an artist. So yeah, I'll do this one more bonus thing for just those of you who are still here. This is a proposal that was shared by a client of mine, Marta Gallia. I always pronounce her last name incorrectly, but I think I got it right that time, Marta Gallia. And um, this one was a not discussed specific games page. And this one was a much later revision that we worked on together, that she and I worked on together after she'd become a client, that was scored and ultimately funded. I don't remember whether this is the funded version or just the 16 percentile. She had like a 16 percentile, which wasn't quite enough, and then an 8 percentile. And she did, by the way, give me permission to share these as part of our grant example library. And I just wanted to especially highlight in this concept of the big idea, and how the big idea is, it's kind of hard to understand really what the compelling big idea is in this particular version. So here, if we read just the particular part, the goals of this proposal are to identify the breadth of host and viral RNAs targeted by PAX and to define the mechanisms underlying PAX targeting specificity. That one is, it's kind of like, well, but why would you really do that? Why is that important? And how does that have to do with, sort of this introductory paragraph? And so it's really looking at this, it's very hard to pull out for me a clear big idea that I think would be compelling for that audience, which was one of the NIAID study sections, it'd be very difficult to pull out the big idea. And it's um, and the story is just the story layers aren't there to build to the big idea. So it really is missing on both of those things that I told you about. And we were able to, through lots of iteration, through me giving feedback and Marta iterating and getting frustrated with me, and then me giving more feedback and her iterating and getting frustrated, like, why don't you like this yet? I think she thought I was evil for a while. Um, ultimately arriving at this, which was much closer. And you immediately can see how much more story there is actually framing what's going on in this proposal. That's the first thing. The second thing is the actual story, the unique mechanism comes out much more clearly, especially as part of the big idea. So it has both the promise and the unique mechanism. So let me actually break that down more specifically. The big promise is in this part, um, really this idea of that viruses aren't triggering this big cytokine response, but if they lack this thing, they trigger a big cytokine response. And this idea of cytokine responses is really important. I'm not being very concise here, I know, but I'm not as familiar. I'm like doing this from memory. Cytokine responses are important because they determine much of our response to any virus infection is actually our immune response and the damage that our own immune response can do to ourselves. And here she has essentially a lever she can pull in the viruses, or a lever that the viruses are using, I guess, not that she can pull yet. It's not at that point, but that the virus pulls to dampen the immune response. Really interesting thing. This has huge potential in so many ways. So that's the big promise. And the unique mechanism is looking at this particular PAX and how it is spliced and regulated in that way, and how it's actually functioning to cause this in order to find ultimately a lever that we could, as humans, pull to do the same thing, to dampen our own response when we're having an over response to a virus, for example. And it's much better here. Here it was missing all of that. So basically, this is illustrating how we have the combination of that big idea, that big promise and unique mechanism, plus a much better story, but still simple and clear, not fact-laden, about that particular big idea. And it's so powerful to have that combination. And then, you know, you can have AI or you can have yourself write the actual words around that. It's just the key is keeping those words simple, clear, and concise. I mean, there's still an element of grantsmanship to it, especially if you don't want to use AI. There's still an element of grantsmanship, but the real grantsmanship is in figuring out that big idea and figuring out that story. Okay, I'm now repeating myself, so I will save you from hearing more of me repeating myself. Thanks again for attending. It's great seeing you all here. I really hope you got a lot out of this, and I look forward to hearing from you